Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, venerable monks and nuns, honorable guests, speakers, and everyone who have come today for the International Conference on Neuroscience and Buddhist Psychology, organized by Tibet House, the Culture Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So to begin with, may I request our honorable chief guest, Professor Shyam B. Menon, Vice Chancellor, Ambedkar University, Delhi, Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdil, Director, Tibet House, and Professor Sion Ramon to come on the dais and light the lamp. Before we go with the actual program, I would like to give you an overview of Tibet House. Tibet House was founded in 1965 by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to preserve and disseminate the unique cultural heritage of Tibet and to provide a center for Tibetan and Buddhist studies. Tibet House has a museum of valuable Tibetan art and artifacts, as well as a library over 5,000 volumes of manuscripts and books, a conference hall where weekly philosophy classes and monthly lectures are held, and a bookshop. Tibet House offers incentives and resources for research and translation projects and publishes important texts. It hosts lectures, exhibitions, and conferences, film screenings, and festivals. These programs mainly focus on Indian and Tibetan Buddhist history, religion, philosophy, art, and literature, and bear witness to the vital, evolving heritage of the Tibetan people. Now, starting out with the actual program, may I request Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdil, Director, Tibet House, to address the gathering about the significance of the conference. Thank you.
Good morning, all of you. Respected Vice Chancellor of Dr. Ambedkar University, Dr. Shyam Menon, and my very dear friend, and also Tibet House's very dear friend, Dr. Sion, and the Venerables, and all the other participants. And I'm very happy to see many young new faces. So welcome you all to this program. You may be wondering as to say, after all these conferences, finally what is the outcome? What do we expect out of these conferences? This is the point that we need to reflect on. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the pioneer of the universal ethics, wherever he travels. In fact, I also had the honor of accompanying His Holiness for several years, and it is my personal experience that wherever he traveled and meeting with experts, meeting with scholars, meeting with the entrepreneurs and so forth, and the CEOs, one question that always come to him is, while the modern education has reached to such a height of development, what is intended out of this modern education, that is, the crisis in the world, should come down. On the contrary, it is always escalating year on year, year by year, and decade by decade, and century by century. So this was a question. Then it is followed by, where do we go wrong? This was the question. Then His Holiness the Dalai Lama without second thought, his reply: modern education, 500 years back in time, modern education was balanced, particularly in the context of Judeo-Christian the countries. Modern education was backed or balanced by the churches, where the churches took care of heart development, and the modern education took care of brain development. And then the influence of church, with the advent of the modern education, with the advent of the modern universities, influence of church automatically declined. It went to decline. And because of which brain development continued to escalate, and the heart development, it started to go down. And His Holiness said that the reality is that modern education should have some form of paradigm shift from pure involvement with brain development. There should be the inclusion of the heart development programs. Unfortunately, this never happened. Because of which, brain development continues to advance, but heart development is lacking. And with the brain development, which is like the weapon, and the heart development, which should be like the motivation, the driving force, motivation. When that part is lacking, then the opposite force of the heart development will take over, which is the hatred. And this hatred, when drives this brilliant brain, can bring about terrorism, can bring about the whole disaster, corruption. And saying somebody may be caught, arrested for stealing 1,000 rupees. But there are people who are engaged in massive corruption, which involves crores and crores and billions of dollars. And billions of dollars. So this is what is happening. And yet, they live in such a pride and exotic life, whereas the poor people, they suffer just for stealing 1,000 rupees. Okay. So the problem is that with the brain development, without heart development, people become so sophisticated, and in fact become so professional in doing all the negativities, including terrorism. Terrorism in those days, 500 years ago, and now is very different. The kind of terrorism happening today could not even be envisioned in those days 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And why it has reached to such a sophistication today is because of the brain development, in the absence of the heart development. So then His Holiness says that given that this is reality, what we need to do is that all the nations, all the countries, they should take care to make sure that that part which is the missing link, heart development, must be introduced in the program which everybody emphasizes so much. What is that program? The modern education. For example, in the East, China, India, Burma, and everywhere in the East, we see that we're heavily dependent on a modern education, which is nothing but borrowed from America and England or UK. So that is modern education, which was purely designed to develop your brain and not designed to develop your heart. So what is the outcome of this education system? What's the outcome of this education system? If a child, starting from the young age, if a child says 2 + 2 = 4, then you are applauded. You are a bright child. And if you say 2 plus 2 equals 4-ish, you are such a dull boy, dull girl. And then even though your heart may be amazingly beautiful, you can have the potential to be, you might have the potential to become the second Mahatma Gandhi, second Martin Luther King Jr., and second Mother Teresa. But you are totally discounted because you said 2 plus 2 equals 4-ish. You may not have this brilliant brain, but you might have a brilliant heart, but that's totally discounted in the modern education system. So it is for this reason that His Holiness, over the last many decades, one of the major emphasis that he is placing on is what is known as universal ethics. Earlier, the same was referred to as the secular ethics. Now, it is shifted for some reasons to the label is shifted or changed to universal ethics for the reason that secular, the very purpose of introducing this concept, universal ethics, is defeated when you use the word secular, because there are many religious people who may not be too happy with this. So the basic idea of the universal ethics is to let everybody admire the need for the heart development. Let everybody admire that happiness that we are seeking, whether on the individual level, whether at the level of your family, on the community, on the nation, or the international. The point is that the happiness is grounded on compassion, warm-heartedness, embracing others. So that element, while not neglecting, while not undermining the modern education to develop the brain, that must be added through the modern education system. So much effort is being invested, His Holiness, today. If you see what His Holiness is doing, in fact, we'll see that he's really the champion of the universal ethics today in this world, really the champion. And of course, we see that His Holiness is purely his charisma and the love that he received from the people of the world that he is able to do that. And had it not been the case for his charisma of the love that he received from the people of the world, then, of course, we are stateless people. Stateless means that we don't have a ground. And had it been the case that Tibet is an independent nation, then he is the leader. He can speak the same thing, universal ethics, in the platform of UNO. So where everybody will very naturally, swiftly embrace it. Unfortunately, whether it's for karma or whatever, the thing is that this is not happening. So still, his perseverance, his love for the humanity, his love for the world, this is what is taking this program still going there. Now, the good news is that it's happening in the various levels, particularly on the university levels, a level in America, in the West, and then here also in India, it is now taking some root. Okay, with this in mind, now you may be wondering, so what is that to do with the Neuroscience and Buddhist Psychology Conference? This could be a question. To make it very short, finding this concept, the people on various levels have to be convinced that this is what is lacking. So for that matter, people should be convinced. For to gain conviction, people today see the modern science as God. Whether you explicitly say this or not, people see this as the final truth, the reality. So on that basis, whether through this, what they consider as a truth, modern education, or whether through the traditional way, whatever, the idea is that people should gain conviction. That finally, with this, how the mind works on the brain level, how the mind works on the mental level, and on that basis, finally what I want is whatever is happening with the brain, what is in the mind, it doesn't matter. What I want is, I want happiness, I want to have a good family, happy nation, where there is no conflict, rift happening in the nation, no rift happening on the international level. So this is what everyone is expecting. So for that matter, once you know how the mind works, finally all these things, the terrorism and the lack of, say, the lack of concern for the world, lack of concern for your neighbor. Forget about the world, just even your neighbor and even your family. Such a fragmented family is happening all because of not seeing how the mind works, how the mind works in its, say, the lack of the knowledge that finally your own kindness is the one which actually attracts your happiness. While we expect to have happiness, but we resort to the wrong measures, wrong ways. So it's for this reason that this kind of conference we invite all experts here, and experts, they will shed light on how the mind works, how the brain works, and then they say on the brain level, say where the negative emotions are operated, say amygdala, when the amygdala is activated, when the transmitters are transmitted from one neuron to the other neuron, what's really happening, which kind of transmitter is good, which kind of transmitter is bad, and which part of the brain, when activated, your negative emotions arise, which part of the brain, when activated, your perceptions are the influence, and so forth. So all these things are going to be discussed in the 2-day program. And then likewise, how the same concepts is presented from the Buddhist psychology point of view, say on the empirical, the reality of the mind, not the abstract mind, empirical mind, and then clinically speaking, how that is done from the point of view of the modern science, clinical scientists are here, and then how that is done from the point of view of the traditional Tibetan medicine. So I'm very confident that this is going to be very rich in the exchanges, interactions, and then the exploration. So I pray that all of us here will benefit a lot from the experts here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Gishila. Now may I request Venerable Gishi Dorji Damdur to honor our respected guests with mementos. Our chief guest, Professor Shyam B. Menon, is the founding Vice-Chancellor of Ambedkar University, Delhi. He had been a professor at the Central Institute of Education, University of Delhi since 1994. He had been Dean, Faculty of Education and the Proctor of the University of Delhi, and earlier Director, School of Education, Indira Gandhi National Open University, and Professor at the Central Institute of Educational Technology, NCRT. His work has mainly been in curriculum studies, higher education and teacher education. He edited the journal Perspectives in Education for many years. He is at present on the International Advisory Board of Comparative Education. He was on the Task Force on Access and Equity in Higher Education constituted by the International Association of Universities. Now may I request our chief guest, Professor Shyam B. Menon, to address the gathering.
Thank you. Thank you. It's okay. Venerable Geshe-la, Dr. Sion Rama, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm most grateful for this opportunity of being with you all this morning. I'm thankful to Geshe-la and the Tibet House for thinking of me. I always consider this a great treat, a privilege to always have a some kind of proximity with the activities of the Tibet House. I work in a university named after Dr. Ambedkar, whose life eventually culminated in Buddhism. So there is a major connection between what we do and Buddhism as a path. That's perhaps the only qualification I have to be here, because I'm neither a neuroscientist nor a scholar of or a student of Buddhist scholarship, or for that matter, psychology. All I am is actually there's many years of experience as an educator. I've been very fortunate that all my life I've been in the company of young people, and that has given me some insight as to how the dynamics of individuals and groups of young people work and what their aspirations are. That probably is the only vantage point that is worth looking at this entire complex realities from, so far as I am concerned. I take a cue from what Geshe-la mentioned a little earlier about the failings of education, and I feel that I'm as much a culprit in failing to really meet up to the challenges of unifying the world and unifying the human mind, this fractured human mind and the fractured world through education. As he rightly said, the modern education, particularly modern higher education, the world as we know today, is a product of the age of reason. And age of reason was itself a product of the European Renaissance. And but it's much as its promise was lofty and admirable, the consequences have been somewhat suspect, in the sense it is in this age of reason that we find the most destruction of this planet happening. Actually, we are pushed towards the precipice of a certain planetary disaster because of the age of reason and the products of reason, which is something to be pondered on, reflected on. As far as a former colonial country like India is concerned, higher education, although we had a tradition of higher education, Nalanda and so on, the present systems of higher education in India have sadly nothing to do with them. They essentially came from a much more modest kind of a past, which is as an imperial project, the project of creating an imperial hegemony over the entire planet. So the modern Indian higher education took its origin in the mid-19th century in the form of the three presidency universities in India. Now, they were basically like there was a volcanic eruption in the intellectual Europe, and its lava spread in a uniform or non-uniform manner across the colonial world, the world that was colonized at that point in time, and it formed a thin crust, a very thin crust on the surface of these societies. So this crust was basically that of collaborators. The modern higher education in India's purpose was essentially to co-opt a generation of collaborators who would ensure that the imperial rule over these colonial countries would be smooth. So it had a very, very, very limited project. And sadly, this continued right through the early 20th century and even beyond India's independence. Today, it is not so much an agency of the imperial metropolises. It is the modern Indian higher education is a project of the global capital. So in some sense, the graduates of Indian higher education are prepared to collaborate with the project of the global capital. So it's just a bit of a shift of who the master is, but the structure of servitude is more or less the same, which is the sad situation so far as education is concerned. And the education is very closely intertwined and probably intertwined only with economy. So the whole purpose of education, it appears as though it is actually not to create citizens or not to create members of a vibrant society which is inward looking and transformative, but to create consumers and producers in an economy, which drives education more or less like a force that would make people competitive with each other and which are mostly individual oriented. And in India, this is very clearly seen, particularly in the upper middle class India. You'll see that the kids who are from the class 9 to class 12 are driven into what may be called a coaching class mode, where the sole purpose in life, it appears, is to pass the class 12 board examination and get through one of those select entrance examination to the elite institutions at the higher education level. And it's a make or break, life or death kind of a situation. So much so that many young people end their lives, sadly, not having made it to made it past these gatekeepers. So that's what education has driven itself into. And in the process, what we create, it seems, are people who are intensely competitive, fiercely competitive, self-absorbed, self-centered, obedient, who follow orders, who would basically mindlessly stick to routines, and who would not think beyond themselves. So that's the reason, although education might produce good workers, but it produced terrible spouses, terrible neighbors, and terrible parents, and children of aged parents, and so on and so forth. And so the overall purpose of education, it appears as though it has got increasingly truncated over the past decade. This is the tragedy of education. And the libertarian view, which is taking the in the economic perspective, which is actually also abetting this entire process very sadly. And technology is another aspect which is actually driving us towards this particular thing. For instance, we are now more attached to this this machine than any other human being. So each one of us is, this is like our Siamese twin. We can't think of living without it. And so it always, one carries it with us, one feels insecure without it, and if the charge goes off, then one would get into a depression, and so on and so forth. And what I'm saying in other words is that, the technology is driving us into another kind of neurosis, which I think is something to be watched very carefully. I was listening to a live interview with in the BBC, on the BBC, with Dan Brown, the author of Da Vinci Code, and he was saying that the next advancement in next set of advancement in technology is going to be in the artificial intelligence, AI, which is basically going to fuse this machine into us, the organism. It will be like an implanting this entire thing into our brain or some such thing. So we can actually think of Google, and the Google appears in our in our mind. So we don't really need the necessity for asking a question to someone or engaging on at a human level with another individual becomes that much more diminished. If not in the next decade, but in about 100 years, you'll find that probably, according to his prediction, we may find that we become much more cloistered and, how do you put it, much more confined in our own little spaces with our own technological extensions, that we will need less and less actual human contact, which actually is, in my opinion, for the species, it is an extremely dangerous situation. I wonder what kind of mutation that would happen in this evolutionary process in the species called human being. In this entire thing, one would have expected religion to be a guiding principle or a sentinel or a lighthouse. But unfortunately, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said several times, and I've listened to him say this, and I've always admired his candor in admitting it, he says that, like education, religion has failed too. Because religion, rather than opening up a new path towards exploration of an expansive space of oneself and the connectedness with the universe, the religion is actually pushing us towards more and more towards identity divisions and sectarianism, and in fact become an instrument of a larger divisive politics, which we see in India today very clearly, and also in the rest of the world, many parts of the rest of the world, of which terrorism and other things, as Geshe-la said a little earlier, are only symptoms. So this is another aspect of this dangerous world we seem to be living in at the moment. In this entire rather depressing scenario, I'm sorry, in this morning I should actually present this somewhat pessimistic picture in front of you, but the good thing that's happening is also that gatherings like this is possible. And I also feel that I must congratulate in that sense the Tibet House for taking a lead towards encouraging us to think in these different directions. I consider the greatest fortune that Indian society has had in the latter half of the 20th century, and it continues in the first part of the 21st, is the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama amidst us, and the kind of world and the worldview that he carries with him. Apart from the unfortunate political situation in Tibet that made that a reality, as far as India is concerned, it has been a great opportunity. It has been a great, how do you put it, ray of hope in this otherwise gloomy sky of his presence. And I would tend to think that the Tibet House's initiative here is a part of that, how do you put it, beatific presence of His Holiness amidst us. And in this, I think the perspective which is correctly taken as is represented in this morning's session and in this work, in this conference in the next 2 days, is this interesting synthesis of the perspective of psychology and the perspective of Buddhist scholarship and neurosciences. Psychology is in fact one branch of scholarship which holds the potential of looking inward. Unfortunately, the mainstream psychology has slipped into what could be called the positivist trap and is reducing itself to something like a behavioral economics. So you are more interested in understanding how a shareholder would behave, selling a share or buying a share, and what kind of psychological dynamics that would determine that behavior. That seems to be the kind of problematic that psychology seems to be increasingly addressing, which is very sad, because the whole possibility of psychology as a field of knowledge and the kind of methodologies that it would make possible actually allows for a much more broader and much more deeper inquiry. Unfortunately, the mainstream psychology at this moment is not doing that. But there are some changes happening within the psychology community as well. But in this, I think Buddhist psychology has, I think, a whole lot of new fillip to provide to psychology as a discipline. I am not a scholar in that. I've only been in the company of scholars, so I have picked up here and there some ideas which I will not like to share with you. I'm sure that you will know these things much better. But I'm happy that this exploration is being done. Buddhism, I personally feel very attracted to Buddhism as a religious doctrine, because it is not so much on the basis of some kind of otherworldly utopia that one talks about. It's not so much the nirvana that is paramount in Buddhist philosophy, but the process that is paramount. The practice towards that is what is of primary importance. I have in mind the picture of the Bodhisattva who has one foot in nirvana and 1 foot on the ground, and the Bodhisattva is trying to ferry ordinary people into the realm of nirvana. But he himself, the Bodhisattva himself, never aspires to acquire nirvana himself, because his mission is actually this boatman's mission of taking people across the river. You might have read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha and the boatman and the conversation with the boatman. So that's the kind of picture I have always in my mind of someone who is a practitioner of Buddhism, because Buddhism is about practice. And if you blend our understanding of our inner world through psychology and Buddhist psychology particularly, and the Buddhist practice, then there's a possibility of some kind of inner transformation. Because there is an external world, the transformation of which is actually in the realm of the political. But there is an inner world which actually contributes to the external world in a very significant manner, whose transformation is in our hands. And that happens through a process of practice. And neurosciences now show us the way of doing it, or the process through which it happens, particularly through the new work in brain plasticity. So there is a possibility of transforming one's inner world through practice. The practice of meditation, practice of other kinds of practice of compassion, practice of cultivating certain kinds of emotional state, and so on and so forth. So this is a very interesting area. It is not in the realm of positivism, it is not in the realm of measurables, but at the same time it is in the realm of a certain kind of what may be broadly called an interventionist strategy. It may not be experimental in that sense, but an interventionist strategy. So I would tend to think that this is a very exciting area of scholarship and practice that is converging here. And I'm sure in the next 2 days, there will be very interesting discussions that will be happening in this room and I hope it will emerge in the form of something concrete in terms of what others, people like us outside this space, would be able to gain out of. In the Ambedkar University, Delhi, we have a Center for Engaged Spiritualities. It is engaged spiritualities in plural. So this is a very clumsy formulation, and we ourselves were not sure what exactly that would be, but we intuitively called ourselves in a plural, engaged spiritualities, because we thought that spirituality for us is a exploration of the deeper engagement of individuals with the larger, the larger aspects of the larger reality, whether it be the planet, whether it be the nature, whether it be other living being, other non-living being, and so on and so forth, non-living beings and so on and so forth. And there are alternative exploratory paths for that. That's why this plural, engaged spiritualities. We are not still very sure as to how exactly this exploration will proceed, but we are on an open-ended exploratory mode. And we, this small community of scholars and teachers and students who are participating in this process would look up to your deliberations for some deeper guidance as to how this practice would go on. Once again, I'm most grateful to Geshe-la and the Tibet House for asking me to be here. I'm really fortunate that I always have a ringside view of what's happening in Tibet House, and I hope I'll continue to have that view, and in some sense I'll continue to participate in my own humble way in the activities of the Tibet House. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Menon. Now we will start with the first session of the conference, that is Nature of Consciousness and Psychology. I would like to read out a few guidelines to be followed. All the speakers are requested to finish their presentation within the given duration, so to avoid running behind the timeline, and especially in skipping the question and answer sessions. All the chairpersons of the sessions are requested to keep track of time. And if any extra time is left, it will be used for question and answer session. All abstracts and speaker profiles are available in the booklet. Separate printed copies of the speaker profiles will also be kept on the dais for the chairperson to introduce the speaker. Now I would like to call out the first speaker of the session, Dr. Sion Ramon. Dr. Sion Ramon is an affiliate professor of electrical engineering and neurology at the University of Washington and an emeritus professor of biomedical engineering at Reykjavik University, Iceland. Since 1990, his research efforts have been largely involved with neuroscience, cortical neurodynamics, and brain-mind interactions. He is currently involved in developing new technologies for non-invasive electrical stimulation of the brain to treat epilepsy and stroke. May I request now Dr. Sion Ramon to start with this session, Nature of Consciousness and Psychology from Neuroscience Perspective.
Okay. Well, my friends, I'm happy to be here, and thank you for asking me to be. Thank you for asking me to be part of this presentations, and I'm going to pick up from where about few minutes ago we were. Oh, they can't hear. Okay, can you guys hear me in the back? No, okay. How about now? Okay, now I have to be glued to this way. All right, so I'm going to pick up from the, just 5 minutes ago we were talking about cell phones and how we are tied to it. I do research in biological effects of cell phones also. And there are of course it is an essential item now in our life, but in addition, cell phone radiations do cause many problems, especially change in brain chemicals, hormones, and also some of them are cancer causing. And it has been found, many studies, you can search in the literature, that prolonged use, even if you, after using for half an hour, you put the cell phone away, but the brain chemistry changes and it often shows up into measuring EEG. So something to think about. So my grandfatherly advice will be use the cell phone, but don't get tied to it. Okay, all right. Now going beyond that, nowadays we use even cell phone to look at EEG. And in Seattle, actually epilepsy patients, we teach them how to monitor their own EEG sometimes and see if there are any problems. And in future it will also be used to trigger some kind of a emergency response. If there is some kind of an epilepsy attack is happening, it might alert the 911, the emergency services, and then ambulance would come and take you to hospital. So in a way we are using technology in a good way, but definitely I agree we should not get tied down to the technology itself. It is just a function. Excuse me. Now coming back to the talk of what is consciousness from the neuroscience side, how does it relate to Buddhist psychology, and what can we do with it? Best answer is, as a neuroscientist, we really don't know. I think that's the best answer. Every day, myself and many of my colleagues, not only in Seattle, but many other universities, we talk about it. What is consciousness? There is no definite definition which we can say, okay, this is the way it needs to be defined. So if you talk to majority of the hardcore neuroscientists, their idea will be, here is a brain, and then it has some consciousness which comes from when a bunch of neurons are doing things together, so it's a emerging property, and so when the person dies, brain dies, and that's the end of the consciousness, and just go home. That's about it. However, I'm not an expert on Buddhist philosophy, but I believe from the Buddhist side, and as well as from other traditions, even the Hindu side, they have a lot more or a lot deeper understanding of what mind or consciousness is. So limiting myself to neuroscience, I would say best way to look at it is that we can measure some gross features of the activity. So like if I'm thinking of senses, so like ear, nose, we can definitely see how different parts of the brain light up. in that way, probably those gross features of the consciousness or mind is very well understood in neuroscience and also in the brain research, and probably it will match very well what people talk about in Buddhism or even in psychology. So overall, that area has a very good similarities between neuroscience and psychology, and probably also in Buddhist philosophy. Now, when you move slightly higher up, when you begin to talk about emotions, logic, and discrimination, and or what is nowadays known as a decision-making science, in those areas, definitely neuroscience is doing many types of research, and even within Seattle, where we are involved, we actually have people not from neuroscience alone, but even from psychology, humanities, musicians, philosophers. So it's many aspects we are looking at it. And so we are trying to see how different parts of the brain works and how the neurons work. Now, I'm going to sort of delve more into brain anatomy. So let me see if I can bring one slide. See, I'm supposed to be an expert on computers. Okay, well, I think I already covered that. So let's go. Okay, so anyway, last line. So my task, and not only my task, but it is your task, how to integrate all these things. Philosophy, psychology, sociology, arts, music, and also the neuroscience. So how do we combine all these things? Okay, so neuroscience, this is a very common slide. You can find it in many textbooks. Over the years, with lot of research, we have figured it out where the different parts of the senses are, like speech, motion, motor control, touch and taste, and people who are new to it, that side is front, this side is back. That might be the best way to explain. Yeah, and then of course we have left side and right side, and then we have big names for all the parts, which I will sort of talk about as we go along. Okay, so what we are finding is nowadays many areas, many places where people are studying if you are doing meditation or what's happening, so we can look inside the brain. And compassion, which is a very good practice in Buddhist tradition, when people who are really good in meditation, when we measure their response, like how the blood flows in the brain, so we generally find on that side, that lit area, it is what we call frontal area of the brain. So like this area, and also the frontal, prefrontal, this area lights up. And this is well known, so it shows that during meditation on compassion, that area becomes very active. And so this is something to think about, and it is well researched, and it shows that when we think about compassion, here it will show up. However, let me just warn you, don't think that the neurons which are sitting there, they are responsible for compassion alone. Same neurons could also take part in many other types of activities. So simply thinking of neuron that we will, if I go inside the brain, I will find some neurons for compassion, some neurons for anger. That's not really true. Maybe in future somebody might find something, but right now we find neurons are having activity in many types of things going on. Okay, just to make sure, you guys can hear me in the back, right? Okay, great. So I will continue. Here is another slide. I picked it up. I use it teaching classes in neuroscience. That on one side you are seeing the brain activity. It is again the blood flow measured with MR imaging. For a normal brain, you can see this area lights up and then this area lights up, temporal, frontal areas. But a child which has been deprived of the closeness of mother, like that child was living in a halfway home, you can see there is a lack of the emotional response from the child. So it does show that the developmental brain of a child does have a good response if there was a good connection between mother and a child, or even more social interactions are present. So that's a very good way. Now this is some of the work which we are doing in Iceland, and I will just sort of briefly try to show what am I looking at. These pictures over here on this thing, front of the head is on the top, back of the head there, and left right is the same. So I'm looking at brain activity measured with EEG, and generally what is known as an alpha band, which refers to like eyes open, eyes closed, and then the beta band, which is between 12 to 30 hertz. Beta band is more responsible for like doing some task, so like a task oriented. So what we did, we had two group of people. Actually in Iceland, people think everybody is happy. I mean, it's a very happy country. But what we are finding is their adolescent population has a very high level of anxiety. So we picked up two groups of people who could be low anxiety and could be high anxiety. What we found is alpha activity in low anxiety is low, but in high anxiety people is very high. So like their relaxation or sleeping habits and those things are quite different. But when you go to the mental tasks, so like they are looking at an object and how it is rotating on the screen, so the judgment or the mental task, people with low anxiety, you can see this portion of the brain lighting up. It shows that people with low anxiety could perform good mathematical tasks or could think properly. With high anxiety, less. And to be honest with you, this is more like, in some ways you can say, it's a common knowledge. So all I'm doing is presenting you some data to show, what a common knowledge is, it's actually true. And so that's what I'm presenting. Okay, so going from there, so what I'm trying to show you is that definitely anxiety and many other types of things affect the brain functions. And so what is going on in the brain and how you interact with the outside environment, it affects the psychology. And so definitely bringing neuroscience and psychology, we can learn more about these things. Now since I work in neuroscience, I'm not saying I'm an expert on it, So we are always asking questions. Okay, this is what is going on. So what's the reason? How we could figure things out. So here is a one example of where the neuroscience has been. I must say that we haven't done a good job. So like maybe 150 years ago, there was one guy named Dr. Gall. He was measuring the bumps on the head and assigning different types of like where you might be conscious, where love and beauty and all those things. And it's not, I mean, right now I can laugh about it. But actually in 1930s, some very entrepreneurial person built a machine, some kind of a machine to measure the depth of the bumps on the head, and he can predict what your state of psychological state of your mind is. And he made a lot of money doing that. Okay, so now we know it is all mumbo jumbo, nothing to talk about. Now beyond that, in my own joking way, so like 150 years ago we were on the bumps on the head, and now we have shifted to the bumps in the cortex. And so what is happening is that most of the neuroscience research has gone into looking how the behavior of the neurons, which are inside the gray layer of the brain. And then gray layer is the top portion layer of the brain. That's where majority of the neurons reside. And how they function, this is where majority of the research is going on. So like looking at one of these anatomical slides, if you go deeper into it, you will see a neuron looks like that way, and it will have many fibers going out, nerve connections, and they connect with other neurons in the brain. And this way, most of the neurons try to work together. So this is where majority of the research is going on. I'm also involved in this kind of research, and probably you will see many papers coming out where we'll be describing what is known as the cortical dynamics, how a bunch of neurons working together to give rise to a spontaneous brain activity and also activity when you are doing some task. So those things are coming. Now coming back to the next slide, here, computer is gone. Okay, so I will just talk in the air because there is a time clock is going on also. So what is happening nowadays is that majority of the focus is what is known as the neural correlates of the consciousness. So people are trying to find the lowest denominator of a neuron or a bunch of neurons which can be related to a consciousness experience. And it could be like if I look at external picture, like say like a dog or cat, looking from the information point of view, can I pick up the lowest form of the information related to neurons which can be called a neural correlates of consciousness? I'll be honest with you, even though this is a very big topic of research, but even now there is no definite proof that we will have a lowest neuron or some set of neurons which could represent the consciousness at a very fundamental level. And I will give you my opinion, and I'm sure I'll be proved wrong. I don't think this research is going to lead anywhere, because still most of us believe that the neurons themselves are not the consciousness. I mean, they're just like a unit which takes part in the consciousness. Now, moving from there, oh, here is the thing I was talking about. So like I look at a picture outside, and then looking inside my brain, and I'm trying to figure it out which neuron or which set of neurons which are firing could be related to a dog. But unfortunately, nobody has found anything so far. But this is where a lot of neuroscience research is going. Now then, another set of research groups, they are looking into what is known as a information theory. So can I find the smallest amount of qubit of information which we can relate it to the consciousness? And there is a lot of work going on. In some ways, these theories are needed because it gives us, particularly the neuroscience people, that how a bunch of neurons together could give rise to logical thought processes. So like cognition, logic, discrimination, and in that direction these theories will be really helpful. But at the same time, this may not be a complete picture. But as a neuroscientist, this is where a lot of work is going. Now, if you were to go and begin to talk to a neuroscientist that there are other aspects of the mind also, I don't want to go into Buddhism, but just humor me, and I'm not going to take any sides. Like Buddhism or Hinduism might say we have a very subtle consciousness which goes from one life to the next. As soon as you say that, neuroscience will pack their bag and say, you guys are crazy, and that's the end of the discussion. However, we do have many other areas where we can collaborate. So the collaboration could very definitely be possible where we can measure. So now I will give you a research topic. I know there are some students in the audience too. You know, we can measure EEG, we can see this area lights up or that area lights up or this in anger, emotions, or those things. And now some of you guys are great meditators. So how about doing the meditation of Shine and Shamatha and those things, and see if the same areas light up in your visualizations. And if it does, let's say 50 people show the same thing, suddenly people coming from meditation side, they could match up with the neuroscience what they are saying. So here is my suggestion. So any takers on this research? Go for it. Okay, so now coming back again to neuroscience, I begin to drift in many directions. Now, concerning the psychology and the interaction with the outside world, one main thing comes very often is what is known as a perception of time. And I'm also very much interested in it. And here I have been told time is limited. Okay, so I have to sort of hurry up and talk to the main point. I'm going to very quickly say, let's say for a moment that in the brain there are many areas, and I will just use, because of lack of time, the yellow thing which you are seeing It is in the, this time the front is here, back is there. So the front area takes part into how the time is perceived, and there are many other parts of the brain. And the psychological perception of time is very different from the real clock. In the, let's say, brain or mind, time could slow down or time could even go faster. And it does happen. Example will be like if some person is taking psychedelic drugs, their time goes down very slow. And so it does happen. Okay, so I will give you one example. So I do a lot of measurement of very high density 256 channel EEG data coming. And so here is, so after taking the data, then we do a bunch of mathematical tricks, and then we plot the data. So we might be looking at power, or the synchronization, different parts of the brain. And the next big thing which is coming is known as a transition state, which looks into how the brain behaving. And what we found is one person, we just asked them to sit quietly, do nothing, do their best to remain quiet. So red areas represent brain activities very high. Blue areas represent brain activities becoming quieter and quieter. So if you look the upper portion from 12 milliseconds, 16, 20, and 24, you can see a pattern emerging. So it's about like a 12, very easily you can say 12 to 14 milliseconds. So brain is sort of doing its thing, then it flips, and then it goes into a different state. These are known as state transitions of the brain, and it is almost like a triple point of boiling water. You could be water, ice, or vapor. And brain acts in a very metastable state, so where a slight input, internal or external, it flips it. Now the same, another person who is capable of meditating, so we just ask, just do low level meditation, nothing very complicated. There you can see that they can, she can change the quiet state for a long time. So on one hand you can say, okay, so big deal, so what? But there is many questions which might be of interest to you. A, using your own mind, your own thinking, you can change how brain functions. And it's very common that you can change body functions like a blood pressure, how you breathe, and those things. So if somebody says that the mind-matter interaction doesn't happen, you have one good example. Within your own body and mind, you can control the matter, the physiological processes. It's possible. I mean, still, I cannot control your behavior, but I can control my behavior. So this is one example. So these research which I was showing, what we look for, what is known as a metastable cortical dynamics or phase transitions, and they were invented by one person named Walter Freeman, and we are applying it to many processes nowadays. And this is a very powerful tool, and I'm going to sort of begin to summarize because I am running out of time. Some of these brain research which we did, we begin to look into how long a thought rises and falls, and what we found is that like a finger snapping is a very common way of measuring time. Long time ago, before we had clocks and flat phones, and at that time some of the findings were that probably finger snap is about 0.8 second in a normal person. And these are all written in Hindu and Buddhist literature, and a definition of a moment, or what is called chara. In Western literature, they spell it K-S-A-N-A, which becomes very confusing. Okay, so looking at EEG data, you can see the phase transition I was talking about. If you were to combine rise and fall of a thought, which could become one reflection, is about 1.1 second. And these numbers, even though they are sort of very initial findings, and me being very lazy, I haven't had time to write these things up, but I'll be doing it soon. So it should be available for reading and comments. So that's the one thing I wanted to bring up. And in my own way, I think I'm going to, because lack of time, I will skip this very quickly. If you were doing EEG research, if you look at different bands, then you will see activity of the brain in different bands shows different areas of the brain act up. So like beta will show you different activity, gamma will show another, and high gamma will actually tell you when you have recognized an object. And these things also fall into Buddhist philosophy quite a lot, which often they call it meaning generalities and sound generalities, Drachi and Donchi. My Buddhist colleagues might know those things, and so it's possible. Okay, so coming back to create more confusion, what are models? Nowadays, like a quantum entanglement is sort of become a, okay, I finish in 1 minute or I will disappear. Okay. So quantum entanglement has become a very big thing. About 50, 70 years ago, if you even mention quantum entanglement in physics classes, they will right away throw you out. It is plain nonsense. Now, some experiments are showing that it is possible that you can entangle two photons over long distances, and they're being used for optical communications. And these are very fast communication, and they're being used nowadays. So it's not like something which doesn't happen. Proofs are coming. And if I were to conjecture more, the information flow in the brain might have some entanglement, but I still have to prove. Not yet, but there is a possibility. Coming back to observer influence, this debate is going on in science for a long time, even for almost 100 years. And even now there are one group of scientists saying, why do you need all this thing? But other group of scientists, especially coming from quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, they are saying the way quantum mechanics was invented, it involves a involvement of a observer. Without that, it has no value. So on one hand, they're saying, well, electrons move, coffee maker works, my chai still tastes good, why bother? But then on the other hand, people saying, no, objects interact, and the experimenter interacts with the object, and so in that way, probably Buddhist psychology and Buddhist philosophy will find a lot of common grounds there, And actually, many neuroscientists are also beginning to talk about those things. And I will just show you one more slide. In my younger years, like 1980s, when I had black hair, long, hippie type, at that time I did interact with many great minds in physics, including Henry Stapp. Many discussions about, okay, if it does happen, what's the theoretical explanations? One possibility might be that through the thought processes, we might be able to influence the flow of sodium and potassium in ion channels, which right away gives us a way to control our own body functions as well as our thought processes. Now, this slide is very controversial, but the author, which is Roger Penrose, he is a great mathematician and he has done many things. And I have checked his math. It seems to be correct. And so the idea is way deep inside, at a very elementary level, you have long tubes or microtubules. In that, the information flow as a wave, and you could create interaction patterns which might represent a basic building block of how the outside world might interact, which might also relate to how you could experience an object from outside, and the timing diagrams, how a thought rises, falls, and these theories, they seem to come closer and closer together. And so the brain, it acts in many different time frames. If you go to the subcell level, it is acting at a 100 gigahertz level frequencies. If you go from there to small tissue level, it might be at microsecond level. And if you go to behavioral level, where we're talking about like alpha and like opening, closing eyes, they are more into 1/10 of a second level. So there are different time scales. So based on how you do research, you could pick up the information of the brain activity and relate it to the behavior. Now, coming back to last, and so where do we go? On one hand, you can simply say that we know the gross features. We can also work on higher logical functions. Then the next question you can ask is, if it is happening, what are the models? I would say at this moment, probably quantum entanglement will be the good candidate, and because that gives us the opening that how the mind and matter interacts. And so the old notion that here is this universe came from Big Bang and then suddenly stars formed, and this pesky sentient being sort of came along and did all that, that may be a very old-fashioned model. Somehow I think the consciousness does take part at a very simple level of mind, daily life, but it might also be acting at a very cosmological scales also. And we just have to work more to find out how all these things work. My task in coming years is to study the brain from the cortical neurodynamics and see whether we can develop the conscious experiencing models out of it, and which in turn might help us to define better psychological ways to help people and treat people. So it's all interconnected. And in summary, I know I have rambled on in many areas, nothing in depth, that all of these things require a lot of work and a lot of thinking. And in case you get interested in any aspect of it, you have my email and write to me, and I'll be happy to discuss and talk. And I will stop here. Thank you for taking extra time.
Thank you, Dr. Sion. Now I would like to introduce our second speaker, Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdul, is currently the director of Tibet House, New Delhi, the culture center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. While being the director of Tibet House, he also gives regular lectures and teachings teachings on philosophy in Tibet House and other places as well. He travels widely across India and abroad to teach Buddhist philosophy, psychology, and logic in practice. As assigned by the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he worked with Professor Paul Ekman on His Holiness the Dalai Lama's book, Ethics for a New Millennium Part 2, and the book series Art of Happiness. He has written a number of papers for national and international conferences on topics such as the paradox of the brain and mind and ultimate reality according to Arya Nagarjuna. May I now request Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdul to start with this session.
Okay, you are seeing my face for the second time. And actually, according to the original plan, I was exempted from actually speaking here, particularly on the topic. And then I was in a relaxed mode. I was attending a Buddhist retreat, a 7-day retreat with my friends, group retreat with my friends, and suddenly the juniors, the director, you have to speak. Then, because the actual keynote speaker on Buddhist psychology about the nature of the mind, he requested that he apologized that he could not make it for other reasons, for engagements with other things. So, no choice. One, Tibet's program, and then the Tibet House staff, they directed me that you should speak. Then I just said, okay. Then they said, please send the abstract right now. I was in the middle of the retreat. And then I said, yes, yes. And then I borrowed the laptop. I quickly made something, send there. Okay, so this is more like a penalty for me, sitting here and talking to you. Okay. Anyway, the topic that I should be speaking on behalf of the actual presenter, this is something very close to my heart. How it started was when back in 1988, when many of the participants here were not yet born. 88, I just graduated from high school and I was so keen to go into physics, and my biology teacher was so angry that I dropped biology when joining class 12. Class 11, I took biology, and she was so happy and expecting that, oh, this boy would become this, so forth. And class 12, I dropped biology, just wanting to jump to, not really jump, emphasize on physics. So physics and mathematics. And then my biology teacher was very unhappy, and then she and some of you might be knowing who she is. She is currently the principal of His Holiness, the college in the name of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Bangalore. Okay, but don't tell this to her. Okay, she was so upset, and then she somehow directed the mathematics teacher to persuade me to continue with my biology, but I insisted not to. And later on, what happened was that maybe it is a punishment for me again for dropping biology. Then joining Institute of Buddhist Dialectics, although I was so keen to go into physics, then for some reasons I changed my stream and joined the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics and pursued my philosophy studies. So here comes why this topic is very close to my mind, was that a medical doctor, she was to give a talk on the workings of the brain, about neuroscience, in the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics, to the monks there. And because of my exposure to modern education, so the institute principal, my teacher, Venerable Geshe Lobsang Gyatso Rinpoche, so he somehow assigned me to be the translator, because most monks, they did not speak English. So I was a translator, and then the neuroscience, the kind of neuroscience and the brain that we were introduced till class 11, class 12 I dropped, till class 11 was very coarse. And then the presentation that she made was so amazing. What Dr. Sion was making the presentation here, very much like that. And I was so impressed as a very young boy, like age 19, so impressed. And not only impressed, there was a total earthquake happening in my mind. You know what earthquake? I embrace Buddhist philosophy, Buddhism, as my mainstream. Now the question arises whether or not there is a mind different from the brain. If everything what she was speaking of, say for example, the language is because of this part of the brain, sound, hearing sound because of this part of the brain, and appreciating aesthetics is because of this part of the brain, and your emotional states because of this part of the brain, and your computing skills because of this part of the brain. All this, and she just reduced every thing to the brain. And this young boy, so he who so innocently even left physics and jumped to the Buddhist philosophy, there was an earthquake happening in the middle of the earthquake. Okay, so that night I did not have a sleep. So what am I doing? If this is the reality, what am I doing? Why should I be so stubbornly saying that what neuroscientists are saying is wrong, what the Buddhism is saying is correct? Why should I be so biased? Stick to the reality. This was how I started my journey. Then the question arises, whether or not there's a mind which is different from the brain. This is how I started my journey. Although my basic, the philosophy with which I already started to embrace, said that yes, there is a mind which is different from the brain. And I'm very fortunate that I was in the institute which emphasizes fully dedicated on the academics of the Buddhist philosophy. I was so fortunate. Had it been the case that I was admitted in some, say, the ritual-oriented monasteries, by then I think I would be a very different person. So this is my journey. So with this in mind, what I'd like to say is that the consciousness or the mind, for that what we need to keep in mind is that first of all we need to say, without going into the details, in a very generic sense, let us say, what is consciousness? What is mind? And then who are those people who try to explain what consciousness is and what mind is? Who are those people? So we see that there's one group of people who speak about consciousness from a very materialistic point of view. from the matter point of view, one. And the other extreme, so one is the matter point of view, and the other extreme, consciousness, something which is so abstract meaning, something which they call as very profound, something which we the ordinary people cannot get access to until you have a very high level of meditation experience. Only then you can get experience to that. Is one thing. So the whole purpose of our gathering here is to look for the commonalities between the neuroscience, which is so empirical in nature, and about consciousness. So since that we're looking for the commonalities, we have to look for ways and means to understand the consciousness, not in something, oh, this is something which we cannot experience, so that is very high level and so forth. So that part, I'm not going to comment anything on that part, so that part we're going to skip. I'm going to skip. Which to be realized only later on. So this is not what we're talking about. Now the mind or the consciousness that I'm going to share with you here from the Buddhist point of view is the way we understand it in an empirical sense. In an empirical sense, meaning that oh, I'm very happy today, I'm very unhappy today. So I learned something new, I did not learn something new. So this is the same thing. So this is known as the empirical, something which is observable and something which can be verified. In other words, something which can be verified by means of observation and experience. So this is the basic platform, basic framework on the basis of which the consciousness is going to be explained, so that we can look for commonalities or differences, whatever, from the point of view of the neuroscience. Otherwise, had it been the case that we have to deal with that consciousness, something which is very cosmic or something which is, so that is something I'm not going to comment. Then there's no basis for neuroscientists, because what the neuroscience going to say is that this part of the brain, when that is activated, this part of the neuron when activated, you have the experience of happiness, you have the language command, and so forth. So which means it's all something empirical, You can experience it. So whereas if that part of the brain is damaged, then you go into depression, or you go into, say, the loss of the memory, loss of the sense of the direction, and so forth. So these are all we are talking about the empirical realities, empirical experience. So the consciousness, what is dealt in with Buddhism, is all what you can empirically experience. Okay, this is what we need to keep in mind. So in a way, it is like from the very the radical materialistic version of consciousness, and even that, as the Dr. Sion said, that there are some neuroscientists. In fact, Eric Handel, a Nobel laureate in physiology, 2004. Also, what is said, in fact, I'm so fond of his book, this book, the Inquiry, Memory, Inquiry into the Memory. Okay, his book. So that book, my favorite book, I read it a lot. And what is said there is, okay, what he said was that currently, in the opening passages of his book, In Search of Memory, okay, the title of the book is In Search of Memory. My memory all disappears. In Search of Memory. So there, what he said was that in the opening passages, he said that according to the current neuroscience, two hypotheses. One, there's no mind, it's just a brain. This is number one. Hypothesis number two, there is mind, but it is the emergent property of the brain. When the brain dies, the mind disappears. So these are the two, say, the basic hypothesis of the current neuroscientists. Okay, and there could be scientists, there could be, say, some neuroscientists who say, yes, there is consciousness which is different from the brain like this, but the mainstream neuroscience, and these are the two hypotheses. So these were not to mix the two things. Okay, so with this, the Buddha said that just see, instead of the Buddha said it like this. Instead of that, just see whether it is true in your own, from the point of view of your own experience, that mind is the chief and precedes them all. If with a pure mind one acts or speaks, happiness will follow like a cart following an ox. Okay, what is being said here is that all movements today, anything that we do, they're all directed by mind. And say, I'm happy, I'm not happy. This is all to do with your mind. This is all to do with your mind. Say, physically, you may be so attractive, so young, but mentally you can be very unhappy. And physically, you may not be so good or healthy, but mentally you could be very happy. Perhaps that time, for whatever reason, you might be experiencing the greatest phase of happiness in your life. So there, the point that whether the mind is different from the brain or same with the brain, but the brain dies, the mind disappears. Whatever is the case, that faculty within us, which is known mind, this is the most important thing which determines our life. What do you want to do? A child, what the child likes to do, he or she. And then the elderly, what they're doing now, how to spend their life, the remaining part of life. And then what kind of passions you have, habits, the hobbies, and so forth. And then how to drive the nation, how to drive the world. So this is all determined by the thought processes. So this thought process, I'm not talking about, yes, it exists as different from the brain. I'm not saying this. What I'm saying that part is so important that cannot be denied. So now this is the question. What is this thought process which is so important that I'm happy, I'm not happy, this is what I do to my family, this is what I do for the nation, for the government, for the world, and so forth. That thought process, what is that? This question. So for that matter, I read many of the articles from the neuroscientists, the various neuroscientists, and one thing, as I said earlier, what Aristotle said. The brain, there's no mind, it's just a brain. Number two, the mind is there, but it's the emerging property of the brain. The moment the brain dies, the mind disappears. Okay, so now the question is, what is that mind which is so important, which determines who we are? What is that mind? This question. So for that matter, I like to give you a very quick exercise. Let us do a very quick exercise. Say, my very dear neuroscientist, Richard Davidson, he is, let's say, he is in the other room and waiting to conduct the experiment on you. And then I instruct you to think of yourself as a young girl or as a young boy, age 5, enjoying the best of your moment of your life, being cuddled by your mother, so affectionately, so lovingly, and you are enjoying so much. Okay. So seriously think about it now. Think about it very quickly. Think about it. So imagine that you are being a very young girl and your mother is cuddling with so much love, affection, so forth. And then I tell you, don't share what you're thinking with my dear friend, the neuroscientist, who's waiting next row. And then the neuroscientist will take you there. We'll take it there. Then he wants to know what you're thinking. Then what he did is that he puts you in the fMRI, under the fMRI scan. So in the scan, he could see your brain waves. He could see your brain waves, and he would also see your, say, the neural synaptic connections and what kind of the transmitters are activated, the chemical, electrical, right? So this is what he's seeing. And these things he could see very clearly. He could see very clearly, but he does not know what you're thinking. Can you understand this? Very good. He doesn't know what you're thinking. Now, on the other hand, you as the person under the scan, you know exactly, you have the first-hand experience of what you're thinking. Do you have it or not? Do you know that you're thinking of yourself as a 5-year-old child being cuddled by your mother? Are you sure that you're thinking about it? Or you are just fantasizing? Or you are really thinking about it? You're thinking about it. So you have the first-hand experience of this thought process within you, which the neuroscientist doesn't have. So that one, and whereas the neuroscientist, he has a first-hand experience of what's going in your brain waves, the activation of the firing of the neurons and so forth. All these things he could so well, right? Now, look at the difference. We are talking about the same thing. We are talking the same thing. What are you thinking? This is my question. And the neuroscientists would say that, whatever thought process that's going in this person, so this part of the brain is activated, and this is the brain wave, and these are the neural firings happening. Okay, and then I ask you, you will say the thought process which is going in me is myself being cuddled, being as 5 years old girl or boy being cuddled by my mother when I was 5 years old. Okay, so there are two explanations coming. So the explanations as given by you, the referent of the explanation which you are giving, that is known as your mind, which the neuroscientist cannot see. Explanation which the neuroscientist, the referent of the explanation given by the neuroscientist, which you cannot see, is your brain. You cannot see your brain. You cannot see your brain waves. So that is the distinction. And this is undeniable fact. Say the thought process which you have the first-hand experience, that is the one which determines the happiness of the world, happiness of the individual, the harmony of the world, or the terrorism, or the corruption, or the truthfulness, the officials, or a kind mother, or as a kind, say, the brother or sister, or a very skilled teacher, or unskilled teacher. All these things are determined by this thought process, which you have the first-hand experience, which the neuroscientist doesn't have. And yet this is so important. This is so important to know what this is. So from this we see that there's a split. There's a split in terms of explanation. Yet what is happening is there's a correlation there. The dynamics of the thought processes and the brains, there's a very close correlation there, which was actually very clearly explicated by one of the great logician, 7th century logician by the name Acharya Dharamkirti. In his text, Pramanavartika, he explained this so well. And he's not to the extent saying that it's just a mind, the brain is nothing, it's just useless. This is not what he's saying. Nor is he saying that it's just a pure brain. So he's saying that there's a very close, what you're experiencing, the first-hand experience that you have, the referent of the experience, and the referent of the experience that neuroscientist has. So these two are operating on the same object, and yet it is like two things operating within the same unit. And this is something which is undeniable fact. Nobody can deny this fact. So these are the kind of the reflections we need to keep in mind. Now, when you go into this dynamism of the thought processes, we see that we can see that these, what we call thought processes, to be more precise, the mental activities. These mental activities, we can see that it is happening on two levels. One is the sensory, and one is the on the mental level. Sensory level and the mental level too. So sensory, for example, say when you see this lamb there, oh yeah, by the way, this lamb, we forgot. Okay. That's interesting. Okay, so say, seeing this lamb, and you know that there are these lambs there. So this is operating on your sensory consciousness. So here you look at it and you mentally think, oh, the poor lambs, they're not being lit. Okay, so then you mentally imagine that, oh, these are very beautifully, say, blazing lambs. You mentally imagine that. That is not operating on the sensory level, it's operating on the mental level. So there, the thought processes come into play on that level. So there's a stark contrast between how the mind operates, one on the sensory level and one on the thought process level or the mental consciousness level. Okay. Okay. Now with this, is it really necessary? Is it really necessary that people coming to this conference or anybody should accept existence of a mind which is different from the brain? Is it necessary? This question. Is it necessary or not? This question. So for that matter, what I may as well say is that it would be very interesting. It would be very interesting nowadays. Is what is being accepted in the field of medicine. In the field of medicine, that the correlation between these two things, which the doctors could see, which the doctors could determine, and which the patients could determine. There are two things. Earlier, the doctors, meaning say 100 years ago or 500 years ago, the doctors, particularly the allopathic doctors, and of course the Tibetan medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, this is slightly different. They right from the beginning, they talk about the correlation between the brain and the mind, correlation between the body, the matter and the mind. Whereas particularly the allopathic, the medical doctors, in the olden times, what they feel is that any problem that we have, whether psychological or whatever, we can fix it through we should be able to fix it. Okay, we should be able to fix it through just fixing the body, the brain. And now what is being acknowledged is that even for the healing, to fix means to heal the patient. To heal, it is not 100% in the hands of the doctors. So the first thing the doctors have to do is to let the patients have the sense of confidence and trust in the doctors, which is a psychological process. If the patient does not trust the doctor, however, the best treatment that you give to the patient, healing takes a long time. Whereas the moment the patient has a trust in the doctor, healing so fast. This is what is being discovered today. So therefore, the medical doctors, the first thing they try to do is to try to gain the conviction and the confidence of the patient. So there's such a correlation there. Now, the point is, okay, if there is a mind, yes, I can feel this thought process with me that I'm being cuddled by my mother. This is so obvious as a first-time experience. But what is that like? What exactly is that? This question. What exactly is that if there is not the brain? Brain I cannot see, but I have this first-hand experience. And keep in mind that Of course, nowadays we can see that just simply by reading the brain waves, you can see that the doctors or the medical neuroscientists, they will say the very thing, whether you're angry, whether you are unhappy, and so forth. They can know this. Okay. Don't mix up the two things. Even these neuroscientists, when they say this part of the brain is for language, this part of the brain is for, say, the emotions and so forth, and particularly within the emotions, attachment, anger, whatever. And of course, say the same activity of the brain, same activity of the neurons, same part of the neurons, I should say, same part of the neurons when fired, right? At one time it can be attachment, at one other time it can be compassion, so the anger. This is possible. So these details we keep aside for time being. What I'm saying is that what exactly is this mind, which we can so first the first-hand experience we have, which the neuroscientists they don't have, right? So the neuroscientists they create the dictionary of the emotions. How they create the dictionary of the mental functions. How they create? Okay, we think that the neuroscientists, now you are thinking about, say, in a very core sense, they would say that, now you're thinking about, say, something destructive. Don't be destructive, don't be negative, be positive. You're thinking the negative way, because this part of the brain is activated. So this is what the neuroscientists, they know. But how did they come to know that? Then does it mean that the brain activities, they themselves, or the neurons per se, they are the consciousness which you have the first-hand experience? This question, answer is not, because the neuroscientists, they took so much effort to create the dictionary. How do they create the dictionary? Say you are put under the fMRI scan. And then the doctors would say activate some part of the brain, some part of the neurons. And then you are asked, what are you thinking now? What are you thinking? I'm feeling sad. This part of the brain, this is for the sadness. They create a dictionary like this. Not that they see one part of the brain activated, you are angry, you are happy. No, this is not how they decide. They create a dictionary, they put effort, trying to look for the correlation, very gross correlation at the moment. So later on it can become very sophisticated. Still, it would still remain in the domain of having to depend on creating the dictionaries, which means that what experiencing, the very concept of creating the dictionary means that you have the experience which is first-hand, which you experience in first-hand, which the scientists they do not have. They have to simply trust on the basis of what you express. So we have the first-hand experience, scientists they do not have. What a scientist can see is not what he's seeing. So this distinction is required. Now with this in mind, the next question is, what is that entity which you're experiencing, which the scientist cannot see? What is that experience? What is that? What is the nature of that? This question. So the whole concept, the Buddhist calls the nature of the mind. So it is described as the agent of clarity and cognition. Agent of clarity and cognition is the nature of this experience, which is known as the mind, as per the advocates of the mind to be distinct from the brain, which we have a first-hand experience, which the scientists do not have. And of course, with question of time, I cannot go more into detail. So perhaps during the question and answer later on, we can discuss about how, say, what are the mechanisms by which this thought process, happiness, unhappiness, the stress, tension, depression, or euphoria, all these experiences, that they can be controlled on the basis of the changing the perceptions to the mind. Okay, so thank you very much. And once again, I should not sit down until I acknowledge that earlier I was always behind organizing these conferences, always scolding the staff. The staff, they suffer so much. Okay, so now is the time where they are far ahead of me. Tibetan staff, they are far ahead of the director. So I just came, And then how they organize everything is so good, except for this lamp, so we'll light later on, right? So behind all these things, no doubt, is our secretary, Tenzin Dedrona. Miss Tenzin Dedrona, is she here? She's not here. I'm extremely, extremely grateful to her. So her many years of experience, and amazing the skill in the management and the organization and so forth. And now the younger staffs, because of her presence, the younger staffs, even they are becoming so competent in that. I'm extremely thankful to this in Dedrona. There's the Tenjula here, then Ashokji here, and then we have all these young staffs here. I'm so extremely grateful. Thank you to all the staff at Tibet House. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Geshe-la. We're now done with the first session of the conference. Due to shortage of time, we have to skip the question and answer session. We'll now have 15 minutes for tea, and we'll come back at 12:15. Thank you. May I request our delegates to light the lamp?
It was very good. I learned a lot. Oh, thank you.